Well, a good evening to you. Hope you've had a good Lord's Day thus far. Hope the service this morning was a blessing, a help to you in some way. And now you're perhaps gathering together with some other people, having some fellowship this evening. Just hope you spend some time in prayer. And may this be a time of looking into the Word and getting some encouragement from the Word. You know, there's some passages of Scripture that are just rich in every verse with something applicable, and you can really get your teeth into something. Like in First Peter this morning. Seriously, I just wondered, should I just really slow this down, because I could take just a couple of verses at a time and deal with that passage, because there's just so much in there. Well, that's how some passages of Scripture are. There are other passages that, to our modern ears and eyes and so forth, are a little more mundane and a little more work to get through. So, for example, I want to share some thoughts from First Chronicles this evening, and this is a passage of Scripture, a section of Scripture that a lot of Christians just kind of avoid. The whole book of Chronicles, First and Second Chronicles, because there's so much in it that is kind of mundane, lists of names and so on and so forth, and a lot of detail stuff that doesn't really seem to have a lot of practical application for us in our day. And I understand that. I really do. But at the same time, all Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable. So there's some profit here. And so what I want to do is look at a passage of Scripture that was in our Bible reading schedule for February 2nd, this past week. And the daily devotional that I tried to share on that day, for some reason, the sound just went out on it and didn't get good. I just had to scrap it. I didn't even realize it till after the recording was made, and then the day that the thing was supposed to broadcast, I discovered that the sound was gone on it. So I just scrapped it, pulled the recording. So I wanted to share the thoughts that are found here in this section of Scripture, because I think it's really helpful to us in this, again, rather mundane section of Scripture. So I'm talking about First Chronicles, chapter 26 and 27, and in this section, it just seems to be like a whole list of people and names and responsibilities that they had and so forth, and that's exactly what it is. But let me emphasize three ideas from this passage. The first is that every task in the service of the Lord is important. Every task, no matter how seemingly insignificant that task might be. So, for example, in these two chapters, you have individuals that were gatekeepers, watchmen, some who were treasurers, some who were working in the fields. For example, let's turn to chapter 27, and in verses 25 to 31, just listen to the different areas of responsibility that individuals had. So verse 25, there's this man, Asmaveth, who was over the king's treasuries. All right, so he was a treasurer. Pretty important responsibility in the work of the Lord. Okay. Then there was Uzziah, who was over the storehouses in the field. All right, well, that doesn't seem to be quite so directly connected to something, in the Lord's work, over the storehouses in the field and in the cities and the villages and the fortresses. Okay, well, that's a pretty important job. He's over all of the warehouses for the different commodities. Well, then there's this guy, Ezra, in verse 26, who was over those who did work in the work of the field for tilling the ground. This guy was over the people who hoed the land and cultivated the field. Shimei, in verse 27, was over the vineyards, and Zabdi was over the produce of the vineyards. The next verse, 28, Baal-Hanan was over the olive trees and the sycamore trees that were in the lowlands, but Joash was over the store of oil. So you have one guy who is over the trees, another guy who is over the oil from the fruit of the trees. Again, I just want you to see that none of these tasks seem to be directly connected like to the temple or to temple worship or anything, but these are God's people serving in God's service, and they're all important tasks. Verse 29, this guy Shitrai was over the herds that fed in Sharon. Another guy, Adlai, was over the herds that were in the valleys. And verse 30, there's an Ishmaelite who was over the camels, and another fellow who was over the donkeys. And finally, in verse 31, this fellow Jaziz was over the flocks, and all of these officials were over David's property. So there are all these different individuals with their different tasks and responsibilities that are scattered out throughout the realm, and they all had a job to do. And all of those jobs were important. There is no task in the service of the Lord that is not important. So think about that. You can think about that in relationship to the local church and the ministry of the local church. You have musicians, you have teachers, you have people who work in the nursery, you have the song leader, you have ushers, you have people who hand out bulletins, you have people that count the money, you have people that take care of the grounds and the property and a bunch of other different things. That's just at the church property. That's the service of the Lord. But it's not only what happens at the church property that is the service of the Lord. What is your calling? What is your calling? Are you called to be a homemaker, housewife, homeschool teacher, working in the workforce, in an office, at the plant? What is your calling in life? Whatever that calling is, if you're doing it unto the Lord, you're serving the Lord. That's an important task in the work of the Lord. So I find that to be brought out here in this, what may seem to be otherwise, mundane passage of Scripture. A second thing that's brought out here in chapter 26 and verse 13 is that no one is too important for the most menial task. Here's what I mean. In verse 13, 26, it says, they cast lots for each gate. Now, this is to find out who's going to serve at the different gates as a gatekeeper. But it goes on to say, they cast lots for each gate, the small as well as the great, according to their father's house. So it didn't matter where they ranked in the family. The lots were cast, and if the lot came up for you, you served as a gatekeeper. You weren't too big for that job. So no one is too important for a menial task. Now, I saw a good illustration of this early on in my ministry experience. I was serving as an assistant pastor, so I was in my 20s, and I was working under a gentleman, a pastor, who was 60, I think 62, 63, something like that. And he'd been at this church for about 30 years, 25 years or so. And the church was about 700. And one day I walked into the restroom, and he was there, and he was at the sink, just finishing up washing his hands at the sink. And I noticed after he finished washing his hands, he took a paper towel, dried off his hands, took another paper towel, and then wiped out the sink. He wiped out the sink. And he could see the expression on my face. I must have been a little puzzled that, he's doing this. I mean, we have janitors and all the rest of this stuff. And he said to me, he looked at me and he kind of smiled and he said, Brian, doesn't matter who you are and how big your church is or anything else. You never get to be too big to clean out a sink. And with that, he threw the paper towel in the trash and he walked out the door. And I thought that was a good lesson to learn very early in the ministry. A third idea that I want to point out in this passage is that the Lord's work should be done decently and in order. There is nothing wrong, nothing ungodly or unspiritual about having order and structure in the Lord's work. And this is brought out when you see, for example, in chapter 26, verses 16 and 17, they're casting the lots for different individuals so that it's not just mayhem that anybody wants to serve at whatever time they can show up and serve, that kind of a thing. No, but it says in verses 16 and 17, to Shupim and Hosa, the lot came out for the west gate, with the Shalaka gate on the ascending highway, watchman opposite watchman. On the east were 6 Levites, on the north 4 each day, on the south 4 each day, and for the storehouse 2 by 2. Now we could go on with that. You see the same kind of organization and structure throughout this passage. And the point is that order is helpful and it's necessary. And that may seem to be quite logical, but there are Christians and places of ministry that seem to think that it's more spiritual if you just wing it, if everything is just spontaneous. For example, before we came to Sterling, I went to potentially candidate at a church in Indiana, and I didn't know anything about the church. I got, I shouldn't say I didn't know anything about it. I did. I got their packet of material, saw their doctrinal statement, all that stuff, and they invited me to come to preach. So we went down for a weekend, and I pulled up to the church, and right away, a bunch of red flags went off. And what those red flags were, they had to do with just what I could see of the building and the grounds, the facility. It looked like just different building projects happened randomly and spontaneously and without any real thought or planning or organization. And that's the way it looked from the outside. And then I went on the inside and I realized it's the same problem on the inside. And I was walking in through the auditorium with one of the gentlemen, and the guy was talking about the little overflow area, and he was telling me, he says, we needed an overflow area at one time, and the pastor just came in one day and started knocking down walls, and I must have looked incredulous. He says, I know it maybe wouldn't be the best way to do it, but hey, it got the job done, and we got the overflow area. And I looked at it, and it looked like somebody had just taken a sledgehammer and knocked a bunch of walls down, 2 different kinds of carpet, and all kinds of things like that. And that was just in the building. And the next day in the service, on the Sunday morning service, I'm sitting in a pew waiting for my time to preach, and the song leader gets up and he's doing some leading in the first song. And then after he finishes the first song and there's an opening prayer, he says, all right, anybody who wants to sing in the choir, come on up during this next song, and then we'll sing. And I'm like, what is that? And then I found out what that was. So during the next song, we stood together to sing this next song, and people from the congregation just came out and went up to the platform. And as they came up to the platform, another guy was handing everybody a piece of paper, a song, and that they were going to sing. They'd never seen it before. Well, I don't say they'd never seen it before, but there was no rehearsal, there was no choir, there was nothing like that. So there they were. I may have shared this story in another devotional, but the point is, it was all done very haphazardly, and there seemed to be an attitude of, this is the spiritual way to do church. Well, what this passage tells us is, no, there is a benefit, and it is not unspiritual to do things decently and in order, to have organization and structure in the work of the ministry. So just a few thoughts from First Chronicles 26 and 27. And as we ponder those thoughts tonight, let's thank the Lord for those who have the gift of administration and organization. And let's thank the Lord for every opportunity to serve him, no matter how large or small. It's an opportunity to show our love and appreciation and our gratitude to the Lord for all that he's done for us and he's given us to do. So, serve the Lord with gladness. Well, I hope you have a good fellowship time the rest of your time this evening. Also, I hope you'll have some time to pray. Do be praying for the requests we shared this morning, and just pray that God will continue to work in those different situations. All right. Have a good evening. God bless.